Good morning, everyone. Good morning from Brussels. On behalf of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar and book talk with Professor Rory Medcalf on his latest book, Contest for the Indo-Pacific: Why China Won't Map the Future. This event is being held in partnership with the Australian mission to the EU, NATO, and Embassy to Belgium. I am Garima Mohan, a fellow with GMF Asia, where I lead the work on India and research on the Indo-Pacific. Joining us today, we have two great panelists. First, of course, we have Rory Medcalf, a rare combination of scholar, diplomat, and author who's contributed immensely to scholarship and policy around the Indo-Pacific, most recently with his excellent new book. Welcome, Rory, and thanks for joining us. And to provide a European perspective, we have Dr. Emmanuel Puig, Assistant Deputy Director for Defense Strategy, Ministry for Armed Forces, France. Emmanuel is one of the officials and thinkers most closely involved with France's Indo-Pacific strategy. Welcome, Emmanuel. And of course, welcome also to our audience. Thank you for joining us. Please use the Q&A function to send us your questions while we are talking to the panelists. We'll take the questions towards the end of this webinar. Rory, I'd like to start with you. First of all, congratulations on the book. It was a delight to read. You mentioned towards the end of the book that in a way it is a culmination of the idea of the Indo-Pacific that you started exploring back in 2012. Tell us more how you got interested in the dynamics in the Indo-Pacific and how have they changed since you first started working on it back in 2012? Over to you.
Look, thank you very much, Garima, for hosting this and for the opportunity to speak, particularly to European partners and audiences on this really important set of issues. The book is, I guess, a couple of things. It's at least two things. One is it is a book that tries to describe and analyse the changing strategic environment that my country, Australia, finds itself in, but that also affects so many other countries, not only in the Indo-Pacific region, but globally, because I argue in the book that this is, in a sense, the global region, the global epicentre of competition, prosperity and risk. The second half of the book, I guess, is much more about how to manage particularly the challenge from Chinese power in the Indo-Pacific. And so I look a bit at the policy options that all of our countries have. How and why did I get there? Did I go there? Look, I think in a sense, it was a book that wrote itself over time. It took a little bit longer than I expected because it does really flesh out ideas that I began to play with around 10 years ago, and that in fact I think helped to inform certainly Australian policy at that time, but I think increasingly have contributed to a kind of a ripple effect through the region, with many countries looking at this new, but as I argue in the book, actually old, revived idea of a two-ocean strategic system really at the core of global economic and strategic dynamics. The genesis of all this, just to dwell on this for a moment, actually goes earlier for me, and in a way, having served as an Australian diplomat in India around the turn of the century, if I can use that term these days, I was really struck particularly by the evolving Indian worldview and what I saw as a looming convergence of Indian, Australian, American, and a number of other countries' worldviews, I think increasingly Japan's as well. And I guess I wouldn't say that I called it, or made the call, but I did see a certain inevitability to not only India's engagement with the region to its east, which was in many ways part of its natural strategic environment, but the fact that it was going to be unescapable or inescapable for all of our countries when it came to Chinese power. And in a sense, having seen as a professional, as a diplomat, as an intelligence analyst, the unfolding of Chinese power and influence across this wide two-ocean region over the past 20 years, the book basically wrote itself as a way of tracking this and anticipating what was coming next. And I guess just to conclude on that point, I was I've been surprised by a number of things, but one of the big surprises is how rapidly so many nations, so many governments have begun to recognise an Indo-Pacific strategic environment as having real-world importance for them, including as a way to understand and to cope with Chinese power. And I hope we have a chance to talk about that a little bit more.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned history. What I found particularly fascinating is that the book presents such a rich and detailed history of the Indo-Pacific idea. Many in Europe think it's a rather recent invention, but in fact it isn't. So talk us through that, particularly historically, what does the idea tell us? What can we learn today about how the idea has developed?
Great. Well, look, I'll indulge in a moment in maybe sharing one or two maps that help illustrate what I mean on this. But basically, one of the criticisms of the Indo-Pacific idea is that it's some kind of artificial regional construct. And of course, at one level, all regional constructs are artificial. Asia, Europe, call it what you will. They've all been, to some extent, I guess, imagined at a point in history to suit the policy purposes of governments. And so it is with the Asia Pacific that we were so used to in the late 20th century, and it almost became a kind of an orthodoxy, even though it was very much a term that, in the 1960s, no one had ever heard of, and subsequently with the Indo-Pacific as well. But what I guess surprised myself within the research was to discover what a rich history the idea of a two-ocean Asian strategic system has. When I say Asian, I really mean Asia-centric, but not exclusively Asian. And so to explain what I mean, I'll just share my screen for a moment to bring up a couple of slides. Is that if we think about the region, and incidentally, there's the cover of the book, two editions, the Australian edition, but also Indo-Pacific Empire, which in fact is the edition you're probably more likely to stumble across in Europe or elsewhere in the world. So I'll just go to this quick map to sort of visualise what I mean. So the strategic and economic system that many of us think about as Asia or Asia-centric, I argue in the book, is primarily maritime, and it's primarily two-ocean. In other words, this artificial idea that East Asia is one place, South Asia is another place, the Pacific has one dynamic, the Indian Ocean has another dynamic, while of course it's always true to some extent. You have an Eastern Europe and a Western Europe, or whatever it might be. In fact, throughout history, there's been an extraordinary connection, a kind of connectivity between the two oceans. And that is really what I mean when I talk about the Indo-Pacific. So, to look at it in the present day, and this is an Australian government map from about 8 years ago that was involved in our Defence White Paper, one of the first official documents, in fact, the first official document anywhere in the world to talk about the Indo-Pacific as a framework for policy. It was all about the connectivity, the sea lanes, the energy routes, the trade, and so forth. And of course, much of that is actually East Asian trade and commerce across the Indian Ocean, making indivisible this strategic space. But the history is striking because this is not a new thing. In fact, it's much more the norm throughout history that there was commerce and traffic and connectivity between the Indian and the Pacific Oceans. And so, for example, in this 16th century European map, you see that what was imagined as an Asian economic and strategic system was precisely what we see today as the Indo-Pacific. South Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, even North America, and even a little hint of Australia. If you look at the bottom of this map, which describes Australia as beach, so they knew something about Australia back then, all within a single frame. And I guess throughout history, whether it's going back to literally ancient times, where there were essentially Indian empires or Indian civilizations in Southeast Asia that connected the two oceans, whether it's the Chinese era of the treasure fleets of Zheng He in the early 15th century, whether it's European colonialism, and whether it's the post-colonial movements in the early 20th century, we were consistently looking at this two-ocean space. And just to sort of share two final images there to explain what I mean. On the one hand, we have an Australian map from the 19th century that shows South Asia, East Asia and Southeast Asia all in Australia's, I guess, frame of economic and strategic interest, our trade routes, our security partners, I guess our security challenges as well, within a British imperial context. But then fascinatingly, the other map, which you see here in greater detail, also with that interesting pivot that the Australian map has, a contemporary Chinese map that brings us full circle, if you like, and brings the Indo-Pacific to a modern era, where again, the Indian Ocean actually plays a very central role in the economics, the trade, the energy, the security, the resources that will, from a Chinese point of view, propel Chinese power. And that's why, for example, the protestations the Chinese have about the Indo-Pacific idea, I think, are entirely false, because it's actually China that is making the Indo-Pacific today. And I guess for the rest of us, it's this larger strategic canvas that we use, drawing on history of connectivity. We use this larger place as, I guess, a framework and a justification for the new strategic partnerships that we need. There endeth the history and cartography lesson.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Rory. Those maps are fascinating, especially as how, different countries have imagined the region. It's interesting that you mentioned China. European foreign policy recently has been grappling with the idea of China as an assertive player, in addition to tensions in the transatlantic partnership, the US-Europe partnership. And folks in Europe have been trying to not get caught in the US-China competition, sort of walk a middle line somewhat. Your book shows that Indo-Pacific countries have similar dilemmas, and it talks about the agency of middle players. I think that idea would have a lot of resonance in Europe. Perhaps you can talk to us a little bit more about that.
Thanks. So look, we've had this very lively debate in Australia over the past 10 years about our China policy and our regional policy. And it was summed up, I guess, in a book by a colleague at my university, Hugh White, where he talked about a choice between the US and China. Now, look, of course, at one level, that's true. All countries make choices all the time. But what I think has been very frustrating for many of us in the Australian debate and the regional debate is the way in which this artificially excluded the interests, the agency of so many countries in between. And in fact, as the book argues, so many substantial middle players. And I don't even really like the term middle powers, because we're middle players, where some of us, look at Japan, look at India, arguably are more powerful than traditional middle powers. So the way it's worked in the Indo-Pacific in the past few years, really the past 10 years, but accelerating a lot in the last 2 or 3 years, is that middle players are finding their agency. They are recognising that there are occasions where they can push back against Chinese power. We've seen that happen. We've seen Japan, Australia, India, Vietnam, all in their own ways doing that unilaterally from time to time. But we're increasingly, the pushback, and this isn't gratuitous pushback, this is really about setting limits based on our national interests and values, where this can be more effective if we work in solidarity with one another. So you're seeing a whole web now of what would be called minilateral strategic architecture in the Indo-Pacific. Countries like Australia, India, Indonesia, Japan, beginning to at least conduct dialogue, trusted strategic dialogue on, frankly, on our China challenge, but also begin to put some of the architecture in place of defence exercises, technology, supply chains, training and so forth, capacity building, so that we can have the beginnings of a kind of a resilience. And you're absolutely right, this does not have to be narrowly regional in focus. One of the paradoxes about the Indo-Pacific is that it's both a region, but also in many ways a kind of a metaphor for the global challenge, because it is a region where globally every trading nation has a vital stake in those sea lanes that I've talked about. It's a region where the main challenge is, frankly, what to do about disruptive Chinese power and assertiveness, also at a time where we are having obvious concerns about what America can or will do for us. And so that model of solidarity, of defining limits to Chinese power and influence based on our interests and values, and trying to use that as the basis for a mutually respectful relationship of engagement with China, but also engagement, I guess, plus balancing. That's, I think, precisely the challenge that Europe has. And I think we'll see increasing not only convergence, but I guess mutual learning from the European and the Indo-Pacific experience. And of course, in the end, Europe is arguably an Indo-Pacific actor in itself. Certainly, you know, France is a regional, territorial regional power, but I think all significant European economies have a stake in the future of the Indo-Pacific. And I think in many ways, that's something that most countries in this region actually welcome.
Great, thank you. We'll come back to that later when we bring Emmanuel in the discussion and talk a bit more about Europe. But before I wrap up this section, I wanted to talk about black swans, which I learned from your book can actually be found in Australia. But you actually have a section on black swan events. How do we understand them? I mean, you mentioned pandemics and how they could be an opportunity to cooperate with China. COVID actually has not shown us that. But you also refer to possibilities of military tensions between India and China, and now we see this border conflict emerging. Could you talk a bit more about these events in the Indo-Pacific?
Thanks. Well, look, I think in addition to my interest in maps and geopolitics, and I'm a bit of a sucker for futures analysis, and of course we don't always get it right. In fact, we very rarely get it right in futures analysis. But that's not the point in a way. It's about helping policymakers identify that spectrum of risk in time. And so, yes, I have a chapter about black swans and black elephants as well. A black swan crossed with the elephant in the room. In other words, a problem so obvious and so big that we haven't prepared for it. And I think COVID-19 fits perfectly and tragically into that black elephant category. Black swans are indeed Australian, and we don't consider them to be ugly or unpleasant birds. They're actually how swans should be from our point of view. But of course, the serious point is that because the Indo-Pacific is a vast region where there's all this connectivity driven in many ways by, in fact, China's rise and China's economic rise across the region. You know, the Belt and Road is actually, particularly the Maritime Silk Road, is actually the Indo-Pacific with Chinese characteristics, you could say. In other words, there's this growing horizon of risk. And I think we've seen all around China's periphery this year so many points of risk and tension, whether it's with India, whether it's Hong Kong, whether it's Taiwan, you know, the list goes on. And of course, the whole COVID sort of tragedy. The book makes the point that our nations, particularly middle players and middle powers, need to do more to be prepared for these multiple plausible futures, these black swans. This involves a kind of a five-pillared strategy: diplomacy, deterrence, development, solidarity, and resilience, as I call it. Much of that is obvious, but the challenge is putting it into practice. But also, I guess I make the point that some of these seemingly unforeseen events can also provide opportunity. And I think one of the really sad realities of this year is that there was, in fact, an opportunity with COVID-19 to try to transcend some of the strategic tensions with China. In many ways, it was a choice for China to make as to how it would play out with how it would play with the consequences, the responsibility and the response to COVID-19. Unfortunately, China has made the wrong choice in that regard, and this has affected all of our countries. So I guess if there's one act of self-criticism I'd indulge in about the book, it's that I did mention pandemic in passing as a possible black swan event, but I emphasised that this would be an opportunity to try to, in fact, reduce strategic tensions with China. After all, Britain and France had a 7-year truce during the 100 Years' War when the Black Death struck, when the plague came, but that wasn't to be. But I do hope that that final chapter is a kind of, if readers read nothing else, then they should go straight to the final chapter, I think, for some pretty sobering warnings about how we're going to be in for a very long period of tension in the Indo-Pacific and globally, and middle powers, middle players, particularly democracies, really need to be teaming up.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. And we saw that with the EU and Australia sort of working behind the scenes when it came to the COVID origin inquiry, which also makes the case for Europe being an actor or at least a middle player with other Indo-Pacific middle players. And that is the perfect segue to bring Emmanuel into this conversation. Emmanuel, France has a clearly stated position, strategy on Indo-Pacific. You see yourself as an Indo-Pacific nation. What is the debate in Paris today? And are you working with other member states, capitals to get Europe as a whole on board the Indo-Pacific idea?
Well, thank you, Garima. First of all, let me thank the GMF and you, and of course, Rory for his book. This is a very good opportunity for me to force me out of my cave a little bit. So thank you very much. Well, it has been a long process for, and especially here in the French Ministry for the Armed Forces to conceptualize and operationalize the Indo-Pacific notion. I won't be speaking about the concept, but let's speak about it as a strategic canvas or a framework. It was in the year between 2013, 2015. Then we had this speech by former Ministry of Defense Jean-Yves Le Drian at the Shangri-La Dialogue in 2016, when he definitely extended and wanted to extend the reach and the scope of French action over the Indian Ocean and the South Pacific. And at that time, starting to trying to reach out for European countries to get on board and try to build new ways of cooperating in the region. And then everything changed for us, especially in this ministry, after President Macron's speech in Australia in May 2018, the Garden Island speech. When he spoke openly about the Indo-Pacific and the need for France to be a stakeholder in the Indo-Pacific. So at that time, the framework and the idea, it was a rough cut, and so we began to work on how to operationalize the framework. What should we put on the Indo-Pacific framework, and what does it mean for France activities, strategic vision in the region? And I have to confess that that wasn't so hard, because to begin with, as you said, we have territories scattered from the Indian Ocean to the South Pacific. And between the Indian Ocean and the South Pacific, we have 3 military commands, 2 prison forces, and 5 maritime command. So the main challenge was to create a global coherence and to try to find out exactly what was the dynamics that they all have to tackle at the same time, and not to think in cluster anymore, but trying to build a global vision. So obviously, we came up with this diagnosis of 2 main dynamics. The first being, of course, the connectivity, and with the connectivity, the globalization, transnational crime, organized crime, all the natural resource access, the need for us to protect our economic exclusive zone. And the second, of course, was China, the global reach of China, the fact that China was acting in the South Pacific, but also in the Indian Ocean. But it wasn't all about China, and this is especially what we wanted to emphasize in our strategy. We also are very concerned by what is going on in the northern part of the Indo-Pacific between India and Pakistan. what could be the maritime spillover of the competition between the two, the same kind of maritime spillover that we could find between Saudi Arabia and India and Iran, sorry, and all the things, the new transnational crime networks in the Mozambique Channel, etc., etc. So places where we have stakes, where we also have assets, and where we have in the Mozambique Channel, in the South Pacific territories, so responsibility to act and to protect those citizens and territories. So that was a 1 year and 1.5 year process. I think the debate about the Indo-Pacific is over in Paris. I mean, it's the new framework to think about our strategic commitment, our strategic actions spanning through the entire Indian Ocean and to the South Pacific. So there is no more debate about whether or not the Indo-Pacific should exist. It exists, and now that's a framework, that's a notion, and that's a canvas that we are using in our forthcoming strategic documents. So it's operationalized, and we started to do it by building new bridges between our commands, trying to merge them a little more, trying to build new kind of connectivities between the maritime fusion centers, for example, the commands, increasing our intelligence sharing, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of operationalization of the concept occurring right now.
Thanks, Emmanuel. What you mentioned that France is a stakeholder, right? But so is the rest of Europe. For a lot of European economies which are export focused, for example, Germany, the Indo-Pacific is the second largest export destination outside of Europe. A majority of European exports transit through the Indian Ocean. The EU now has a connectivity strategy and wants to be a global player in connectivity, which of course is a central pillar of the Indo-Pacific strategies of many countries. And then finally, security cooperation. Of course, a lot of people make a big deal about lack of European navies and security, sort of military deployment, but security cooperation is much broader. And Europe is present when you mention IUU fishing, transnational crime, cyber, maritime security, also capacity building, both technical and legal. So in many ways, Europe is already present in the region. My question to you is, to you, Rory, how would a European interest engagement in the Indo-Pacific be perceived by countries in the region? And to you, Emmanuel, is Paris going beyond France? Do you think there is a debate in Brussels, in other European countries, of thinking about engaging in the region, learning what stakes we have, but also does it figure into broader European foreign policy calculus? Maybe, Rory, you can start.
Thank you. And I think, look, I won't obviously speak for the way our French friends would perceive this, but I do think that we need to look beyond purely military or indeed a military first European security engagement in the Indo-Pacific. Of course, it matters. Of course, I think from an Australian point of view, we welcome the French presence and the French role. It's also good to see now and then the British coming back, and I think we will be seeing, despite all of Britain's challenges, we will be seeing some significant British naval visits to the region, and it would be great to see other European flags here as well. I don't think that these visits are unwelcome from a regional point of view. In fact, I think they're quite welcome. I think from an Australian point of view, Indian, Japanese, and indeed much of Southeast Asia, there is a recognition that most of this region is essentially a global commons. The Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, which is really in many ways the heart of the region, and most of which is frankly international waters. That's really important to have a European presence there. But I would say we want to see development assistance, we want to see capacity building, We want to see diplomacy. We want to see the right kinds of intelligence partnerships, frankly, as well, where European partners have a stake. And I think in particular, as we try to form coalitions to protect a rules-based order in this region, which is obviously under enormous challenge, or indeed literally just to help nations like Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, small island states in the South Pacific or the Indian Ocean to maximise the protection of their sovereignty, to improve their own ability to scrutinise, for example, Chinese investment, to ensure that they use Chinese money wisely, or they say no to Chinese money when it's not in their interests. These are all ways in which developed democratic partners can be incredibly helpful. And it's precisely because of that that we don't want to see America acting alone, or indeed ourselves acting alone. And I think Europe would be particularly welcome in that regard.
Two things. The first is that for once, we tend to develop a modest approach. We started by rethinking our capabilities there. And we are definitely trying to increase our capabilities, building new networks, new cooperation. That's the first thing. We are starting to rebuild our network, our capabilities there. That's the first step, and that will make us much more credible. We know perfectly that if we want a seat at the table, we have to bring our own food. So this is what we are going to do. And our message to our European partners is that we are there and we are not going anywhere. So if you need us, we are there. We definitely think that it's in your interest to look precisely at what is going on in the region. And if you want to do something with France, there's absolutely no problem with that. To be frank, both the issue of Chinese activities in the Indian Ocean, in the South Pacific, and the framework of the Indo-Pacific are two items that we are starting to deal with systematically with our European partners. So it's a good thing. It's gradually moving, and we do not conceive ourselves as a flag holder, but much more as a stakeholder and a solution provider in a way, because of the capabilities that we have there.
Great, thank you, Emmanuel, for sharing that with us. I see we are starting to get questions. I would encourage our audience to send questions using the Q&A box. And let's start. We have a few already. I see an interesting one to start with, which says, should we be more worried about a weak or paranoid China, or a strong or internationally engaged China? This is sort of looking at the future, thinking 10, 20 years in advance. Who wants to, maybe Rory, you want to come in here?
Unmuting. Happy to come in there. And I think that goes to, I guess, one of the themes of my book, which is about the future of China. And I guess the Australian edition suggests that China, quote, won't map the future. That doesn't mean, of course, that China will collapse. It really just means that many others are going to have agency. And in fact, China is trying to give the impression that it is perhaps more dominant than it's going to be in the long run. That's a big question, of course. I think the question that I'm seeking to answer here probably puts it a little bit, I'd put it a little bit differently. I think weak and paranoid don't necessarily go together, and strong and intellectually engaged don't necessarily go together. We already have a paranoid China. I think there's no question of that. And it's a willfully paranoid China, unfortunately. This is a China that did not have to be as paranoid as it is, but because of that, that really unfortunate connection between the power and authority of the Communist Party domestically and China's assertiveness internationally as China expands or extends its interests across the Indo-Pacific and globally, we do have a consequence of a strange combination of paranoia and overconfidence on the one hand, but also perhaps an inability to manage risk on the other. And we will see how that goes into the future. What sort of China do we want to see? I think the book makes the argument that there are still multiple plausible futures for China, but these are about choices in China. And I think certainly if China continues in the path that it's going at the moment under Xi Jinping, which is more authoritarian, more assertive, more repressive, and more in many ways, I think, unfortunately quite deaf to many of the interests and sensitivities of other countries, we are going to have a very high probability of multiple points of crisis, and any one of those points of crisis could lead to conflict, as I argue in the book. And so we have to prepare for that and try to shape China's choices there. I think just a final point I'll make there is that, I don't think we should ever completely give up hope on being able to influence China in a positive way, but deterrence is going to be a part of that toolkit of influence, improving the ability of our societies to protect themselves from Chinese influence against foreign interference or against the use of certain technologies to wield influence in our societies. These are all going to be important parts of the toolkit, but the hope being that China will encounter some of these experiences of risk, and the leadership, perhaps a new leadership in time, or at least with different advice, will begin to realise the limits of China's grand power play. The big question is whether, in fact, a lot of this assertiveness is becoming almost impulsive. It's built into the system rather than conscious strategic action. And if it is more, I guess, an automatic set of impulses rather than a conscious strategy, then I think we are going to be in big trouble. But I would certainly like to see, when you say intellectually engaged, I would love to see more of those genuinely thoughtful strategic voices in the Chinese system actually come out and express themselves a bit more. But unfortunately, at the moment, it's not the same China, for example, that I was dealing with as an analyst 10 or 15 years ago. And we have to accept that this is not a normal country in normal times.
Yeah. Rory, another question for you. Of course, a lot of people, when they hear Indo-Pacific, the first thing they think of is the Quad. Our question is, do you think there is a future for the Quad, given that a lot of countries are a bit hesitant to join an overtly anti-China alliance? I mean, I have a few issues with it, but this is the question.
Sure. No, I'm happy to hear the question and happy to address it on its terms. So, I think in many ways there's this obsession with the Quad, the quadrilateral dialogue of Australia, India, Japan, the United States, and it's kind of probably the most written about and sort of fetishised minilateral arrangement in history. A lot more words are written about the Quad than I suspect are ever actually uttered in Quad meetings. This is still a reasonably embryonic strategic arrangement. It's not an alliance. It's not, I think, likely to become a formal alliance anytime soon. It's really in many ways an enhanced dialogue, and it's about sharing strategic assessments, but perhaps beginning to build some cooperative activity under that banner. Look, I think one of the really turning points of the Indo-Pacific was, I think, 15 years ago, when, in response to a dreadful natural disaster, the tsunami in the Indian Ocean that also affected Southeast Asia, a truly Indo-Pacific disaster, those four countries, US, Japan, India, Australia, mobilised and coordinated rapidly in response. And so the Quad was actually born out of disaster relief. And, it's gone on and off since then. It had a very long fallow period until a couple of years ago. But I think it's now here to stay. The Quad is here to stay as a trusted dialogue, now at ministerial level. More will happen below that. But its best achievement, I think, was in fact to make the world safe for trilateralism and bilateralism, because the Quad is kind of the phantom menace that China directs all of its worry and its diplomatic démarches and its propaganda against. The real activities going on behind the scenes between Australia and India bilaterally, as we've seen, India and Japan, US, India, Japan, US, India, Australia, and now with others too. Last point on the Quad, and why I think it's a piece of the architecture, but it's not the only piece by any means, is that at least 3 other countries are now comfortable being part of a kind of a Quad plus arrangement. So we've seen in response to COVID-19 and the health risk, the economic risk, and I think the risk to our long-term geoeconomic future, we've seen South Korea, Vietnam and New Zealand join the Quad countries for regular meetings to discuss how they're coping with this new situation. And I think there will in time be other of those Quad plus arrangements, but I think no one is actually asking all of Southeast Asia or Europe for that matter to suddenly sign up to a NATO-like arrangement with the Quad at its core. It's going to be much more layered and sophisticated than that.
Thank you, Rory. That actually brings us to the next question. We've been asked, where do you see the Australia, France, India trilateral going forward? Do you see potential in that? Emmanuel, would you like to come in here and then we'll go to Rory?
Yes. Well, for France, both Australia and India are the 2 main partners, strategic partners in the regions. We have been thinking about the trilateralization of our cooperation. But let's say that to come back to the modest approach that I was developing before, we are definitely in a way of strengthening our ties with India, trying to build a more robust synergy with Australia, and we don't want to get in a way, in any way, in the relation between New Delhi and Canberra. So I think it may be too soon to think about a real strong trilateralization of this cooperation. Definitely, I think it should be a goal. It should be something that we are trying to realize. But first, our approach here in Paris is to definitely strengthen our ties bilaterally first, to definitely get to know each other and foster our operational cooperation. I'm from the MOD, so at some point you have to think in terms of operationalize it. And so this is the process that are occurring right now. So according to me, and that would be a personal answer, not an official one, but I think it will be maybe too much too soon, but definitely something that we will have to keep in mind and to seek to realize.
Look, I would agree with all of that. One of my, I guess, interests in this is I was the convener or the co-convener with Indian and French colleagues 2 years ago of a 1.5 track Australia-India-France strategic dialogue. And I have to say that in terms, without breaching the Chatham House rule, but in terms of the quality of the discussion, it was probably the best strategic dialogue I've ever been involved in, because you had 3 significant powers, each with overlapping interests in a shared region, common concerns, but actually very different national perspectives. So there was genuine lessons learned and benefit from that. And I guess in time, think tank partners and governments, I think anticipate we'd probably hold that kind of dialogue again, perhaps more frequently. But going to a more operational level, and I think the idea that President Macron talked about in Sydney, which I think was fantastic in principle, of some kind of more active India, France, Australia cooperation, I think we'd want to begin small. I would suggest very much a focus on the Indian Ocean. And in fact, if you look at issues of maritime surveillance, if you look at what I would call the strategic real estate of the Indian Ocean Islands, which my friend Darshana Barua is an expert on and has published on recently, Australia, India and France are extraordinarily well placed to have a shared operating picture that vital part of the global commons, that central or that key part of the Indo-Pacific. So I would prioritise that, and I think that frankly is a matter of time.
Absolutely. I mean, given the focus the Indian foreign policy establishment is putting on the Indian Ocean, and given how strong the India-France, India-Australia partnership bilaterally has become, I think there's a lot of potential. In fact, this meeting is also a France-India-Australia trilateral dialogue.
Absolutely.
Another interesting question that we have is, are the Quad countries and the EU and UK paying enough attention to Chinese soft power? From Myanmar to the Persian Gulf and Horn of Africa, maybe even Djibouti. Emmanuel, do you want to tackle that question and tell us how this is being perceived in Europe?
Yes. Well, in Europe, I don't know, but let me start it back to Paris once again. This is definitely something that we took into account after the setting up of the base in Djibouti. That was a kind of game changer for us. That was in the middle, as I said, of our work on conceptualizing the Indo-Pacific and so on. And the key change was that almost overnight, we had to deal with a Chinese military presence almost side by side with the French forces. And so we had to rethink the whole strategic landscape. We had to rethink exactly what we could achieve, how our operational environment will change starting from there, and what will be the consequences, of course, in the Indian Ocean, but also in the South Pacific. So it changed a lot of things. Let's say that, to be back to your question, we are looking at the soft power. We are looking at what China is doing in terms of information warfare, propaganda. We've seen a lot of things going on with the COVID-19 crisis. In Europe, I think the answer in Europe, in France and Brussels, was pretty strong. But of course, we are looking also at what China is trying to do in the Indian Ocean, in the Indo-Pacific. We can't answer to all those influence operation, but we are trying to, I won't say mitigate them, but pay much more attention to this kind of action, and especially when they are occurring in our environment, whether it is in the Mozambique Channel, near Djibouti, or in the South Pacific. But that's much more a diplomatic issue than a military one. But which brings me back to what Rory said and wrote in his book. That's definitely a multi-dimensional answer that we have to provide to address those issues.
Yeah, look, I think we can be, and I can certainly be a little bit impolite about this. I think it's soft power, but it's also sharp power. You know, that term has been used in, I think, a number of reports about operations or activities that cross that threshold from being essentially legitimate diplomatic influence or legitimate cultural influence to some kind of, I guess, coercive or inducement-based kind of influence. And I think that from an Australian perspective, we've seen that certainly in the South Pacific, in parts of Southeast Asia, also in some of the island countries of the Indian Ocean, and I think undoubtedly in parts of Africa. The response needs to be one where I think a range of countries share the burden of helping those countries that are frankly the targets of that kind of sharp power to strengthen their independence, their sovereignty, their ability to detect and assess that kind of activity, still engage with China, but engage with eyes open. And that's that goes back to my point about capacity building. For example, training of government officials, education of government officials in transparency and accountability, journalism. Good old-fashioned journalism is something that in many of these countries is still part of the lifeblood of democracy, or at least helping democracy survive. And all of these are kinds of antibodies against soft power spilling over into that sharp power influence. And in many ways, that is a more cost-effective way of trying to balance Chinese power than taking a more military approach. And I just should add one last thought there, that I'm a little bit of a heretic within Australia, because I see the Indo-Pacific as certainly extending to the east coast of Africa. In Australia's policy making, we try not to think Africa Indo-Pacific simply because it's too large a strategic space for our capabilities. But there's no question that China's role and influence in Africa is going to be not only critically important to Europe, but actually a key driver of the Indo-Pacific strategic dynamic. And I have no doubt that China will have to make decisions in the years ahead about whether it uses and deploys force in Africa, and that could be a game changer.
Excellent. Thank you, Rory. While I have you, final question, and then we wrap up. This question is asking about sort of what is the broad contours of an architecture where France or European involvement can be most effective in the Indo-Pacific?
I'll lead off on that. I mean, I think we've gone there to some extent already. I think it's about not being afraid to be included in this regional arrangement. I mean, I think there was a time where, not so long ago, where a country like Australia would have actually, let's say 10 or 15 years ago, when it was a seemingly more benign strategic environment, where I don't think Australia would have been particularly enthused about Europe's role in the region, because it all seemed to be about economics. And in that sense, I think, in fact, a European interest in this region, which is purely through a commercial lens, is not necessarily a healthy thing for strategic stability in the region. And I think we've seen that through the way in which, until recently, being polite to European friends, there were some rose-coloured glasses in the way that China was perceived, because it was all about economic opportunity. There have been people in Australia who've thought the same way. Now that Europe's looking to engage in that much more multi-layered way, and to the extent that Europe recognises that the Indo-Pacific's problems are global problems and are Europe's problems, and in fact that there are partners here like Australia, like Japan, like India, then I think that we would welcome that multi-layered European involvement, use the diplomatic institutions in this region. The ASEAN Regional Forum is much maligned because it's ASEAN-centric and a very sort of slow-moving beast. But Europe has membership. Europe has a role to play in that kind of architecture. Ship visits, exercises, but very much that capacity building and dialogue arrangement, I think, is going to be really at the centre. Looking at the South Pacific for Australia, for example, or Southeast Asia, we would love there to be more European partners contributing more to resilience, cyber security, protection of democratic institutions. And I think that can be done affordably even during these very constrained times.
Great, thank you. We have another really interesting question. In case of a Trump re-election, how do you see the role of the US in the Indo-Pacific?
I'll go first on that, if you like. Look, so we're all looking to the US election this year, and of course, I think quite a few of us are hoping for a certain outcome, which is not a Trump re-election. But I would say that either way, I think structurally America is going to remain engaged in the region. I accept the view that there is a sort of a relative decline, and that it's unrealistic for America to seek or maintain primacy on every issue at every time. Even a weaker United States or a distracted United States can still be a powerful actor in the Indo-Pacific, a powerful balancer, enabler, and at times leader in this region. Now, that is less likely under Trump. I think, of course, the more likely outcome at the moment seems to be a Biden presidency. That won't be suddenly a return to 2016, and nor should it be, because I guess the one silver lining of Trump in the Indo-Pacific has been that his administration rattled China. At least it created a sense that China couldn't be the master of infinite risk, which is how China had been behaving for the preceding 7 or 8 years. Having said all of that, of course, allies and partners like Australia are going to be, speaking personally, I would say allies and partners like Australia are going to be worried about what a second Trump presidency would look like, even if it doesn't last very long. We've been making our alliances as resilient as we can so that they can weather this storm. I think a bigger fear, in fact, is a second Trump administration taking an approach with China that is too confrontational and that doesn't also try to leave the door open for coexistence, which in the end is what we all need. So one of the arguments I would make for the kind of middle player solidarity in the Indo-Pacific, preferably with European friends on board, is that it gives us a united front to set limits to Chinese power, but it also gives us a united front of our own to try and give some much needed counsel to the Americans.
Great. Emmanuel, before you answer that question, we've been getting a few questions asking, is there a potential, can we at some point see an EU joint strategy on Indo-Pacific coming out? Gudrun Wacker from SWP mentioned in the comments that there is French-German consultation on this. GMF has been working closely with the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We've been looking at what a European strategy could look like. Could you also perhaps tackle that question? If you can't give us a lot of details, perhaps tell us if you think this is likely in the future.
Well, I hope it will be. So this is an ongoing process. I have to confess that this is a diplomatic process. So we are involved, but not at the same level. We are definitely supporting this process and trying to find out, to share a strategic vision for the Indo-Pacific, to figure out exactly what kind of joint operation or multilateral approach we should foster to stabilize or help stabilizing the region, or participate to mitigate the influence or the competition between external powers. So I think this is a very good process, but as I said, that's a very that's a young process. We are still at the early stage. It takes time. The problem is that Europe is facing a lot of challenges right now, much more closer than the Indo-Pacific. And we have also to deal with the limited resources, which is a constraint, a structural one. So I think it's a good thing that the paper is on the table, is being negotiated. There's a lot of attraction for this problematic. So it may not be at the top 2 priority right now, but it's definitely among the top strategic priorities for several European countries. So that's a good thing. As I said, when we have bilateral talks or multilateral talks within the MODs, we are addressing those issues, thinking about capacity building, common agenda. So that's a good thing. The process is in its way, but we will have to wait a little more to deliver.
Great. Thank you so much. I think we'll wrap up our discussion here just to take a few points from what both of you mentioned and coming back to the original idea, does Europe have a role in the Indo-Pacific? Rory, your book and the points that you make about middle players having agency has a lot of appeal in Europe, but also the practicalities that you mentioned, how Indo-Pacific translates into the idea of issue-based coalitions, working closely with different constellations of partners also has appeal, especially as US-Europe relations continue to deteriorate. Europe is looking for other partners. As I mentioned before, Europe is already present in the Indo-Pacific as a major trade and investment partner. And I think a European approach to Indo-Pacific is not so much about what Europe can do in the region. China has brought a lot of these challenges to Europe itself. Today, Europe faces challenges that are not different from what Indo-Pacific partners are looking at: 5G, connectivity, disinformation, threats of economic retaliation, increasing Chinese influence, including in international organizations. So I think a conversation about a European role in the Indo-Pacific is an opportunity to rethink our Asia policy, diversify our partnerships beyond China, but also to find ways of, these multilateral platforms, these bilats, trilats, to really work with our partners in the Indo-Pacific, because we are tackling similar challenges. We keep looking at it as a region far away. It's very much within Europe's borders. The challenges we face are the same. We'll have a paper coming out from GMF shortly on this. I'm going to plug it, but do go and buy a copy of Rory's book. It's definitely worth your time. It's very interesting. Thanks again to our partners at the Australian Embassy in Brussels. We really appreciate their support. Thank you very much to Rory and Emmanuel for taking the time for this conversation. Thank you to all of you tuning in from all over the world. And we'll see you at the next GMF webinar. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.